I support voter ID. I support requiring proof of citizenship for federal elections. It is true, it's set by law already. Only American citizens should vote in federal elections. Again, it's already the law. Verifying it isn't radical, it's fine administration. And I don't think that that position is automatically voter suppression. But at the same time, I think the way we implement it is something that matters just as much as the principle of voter ID and safe elections itself. Because the real issue for most voters or most Americans is going to be that documentary proof of citizenship is not just the same thing as having like your driver's license, because not everyone has a passport. Birth certificates cost money. Certified copies cost money. Name changes will create discrepancies that cost money. You have to go through a system. DMV access varies depending on where you live. In rural areas, you're going to have to drive 10s, 20s, maybe even 100 miles to go to the nearest DMV in order to get their documentation. And rural voters, like I said, they just don't have the same urban infrastructure as urban voters do. They're in a position where if they don't have this documentation, they're going to have to go out of their way to go get it. So the question isn't necessarily should only citizens vote, because the answer to that is yes. Yes, I think Democrats and Republicans, conservatives, liberals, they can all agree. However, the question is going to be if the government requires documentation to exercise a constitutional right, what obligation does the government have in return? So I've said before that I am a constitutionalist and I align with some policies on both sides. However, a core belief of mine, and I think it should be a common belief in everyone, I think we all hold this belief, is that if the government is going to require something, or if the government is going to require you meet a prerequisite before you exercise a certain right, then it is the government's obligation to make that prerequisite or the ability to achieve that prerequisite accessible and accessible for everyone. It can be low income people, medium, whatever, people in rural areas, people in urban areas. It's their obligation. If you mandate documentation, it must be cheap. It must be accessible and it must be simple, because you're not going to get to impose like this bureaucratic friction on lawful citizens and call that good governance. Now, I don't buy the argument that because voter fraud is rare, we shouldn't verify citizenship. The logic just doesn't hold up. I feel like why would we say no to more security if we're able to make it accessible and easy? Why would we say no? Now, the legitimacy there doesn't just like it doesn't require incompetence. It doesn't require like any unnecessary barriers, and it doesn't require charging people to comply. Some of these documents cost hundreds of dollars, which is a lot for certain families, especially in rural areas. So, if we're going to be serious about voter ID or something like the SAVE Act, which is going through Congress, here's what a responsible version should look like. First, there should be automatic online database verification. Before asking citizens to present physical documents, states should check federal and state databases. So, Social Security records, the Department of Homeland Security, their SAVE verification, and then DMV citizenship indicators. If citizenship is already confirmed electronically, then registration will proceed. There's going to be no extra friction. It should be only if the system can't confirm that a certain individual is a citizen, then additional documentation should be required. Second, if documentation is required, I believe it must be free. If someone needs a certified birth certificate for voter registration, the fee should be waived. If the federal government wants proof, the federal government can reimburse the states. That way, you kind of defeat the federalism argument that somehow exists about this whole issue. And also, you make it so that the financial burden isn't going to be an issue. Also, this links back to previous things that I've talked about on the Purple State of Mind podcast about infrastructure, how important infrastructure is. Because in certain areas, I met a guy a couple of weeks ago at my school who came and gave a presentation. He talked about how when he was growing up, just to get to like a gas station, you have to drive 40 miles or you have to drive 50 miles. Imagine that for a DMV, which is much, much rarer. So, again, that ties back into infrastructure. However, because the pricing itself isn't going to be the only issue. There's more than the pricing there. There's also the accessibility problem. And that's going to be the third thing, accessibility. So there should be mobile DMV units. It doesn't have to be a full office where you can take your driving test, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that would be helpful, but just mobile DMV units, if needed, extended hours around election season if some people need to get their documentation. Also, one of the biggest pet peeves that I have, even when like I was in a year ago when I was trying to schedule my driving test or like my permit exam, they need to have maintained online scheduling systems that actually work, that people actually check, and that should be widespread. There should be an automatic issuance of a free voter identification card to someone who's just turned 18 years old or a naturalized citizen who's proven that they're a citizen. And then in general, automatic issuance for those that qualify, not just the 18 years old, but naturalization itself. I'll reiterate, if you're going to mandate something nationally, you have to build the infrastructure to support. Fourth thing is going to be safeguards. There are going to be mistakes when you use a database. It should be a priority that a naturalized citizen who has the privilege of voting, they should not be mistakenly purged out of the system. So there should be at least 2 independent confirmations before removing someone from voter rolls. There should be a mandatory notice. There should be a response window, and provisional ballots should count if citizenship is verified afterwards. Because the security does not require like reckless removal. We shouldn't just be cleaning people out. In my opinion, the right matters more in a sense than security, just because, like they say, voter fraud is not as widespread as an issue as some of the other things that we see when it comes to fraud. So my position is going to be very simple here. I'm going to summarize. I support voter ID. I support documentary proof of citizenship. I support safer elections, but I also expect competence from the federal government. Security without accessibility is the beginning of poor governance. It is a defining factor. And accessibility without verification will obviously undermine trust. So you can combat both of those issues by governing properly while instituting safeguards. If our democracy wants to mature, if our democracy wants to continue to grow and kind of move out of this rough patch we've had for the last few years, it can definitely do both. That's definitely doable, and it's kind of on the Congress people, it's on policymakers to meet at the table and defeat whatever filibuster is going on, or they need to negotiate and come to a conclusion, because this is something that I think both sides can agree on. I've seen various polls that say 83, 80, whatever, 80%, 85% of Americans or people that were polled genuinely agree with the idea of a voter ID. However, they can also all do, including me, we can all do with these documents being cheaper to obtain. I guess kind of to leave with the notion that I've repeated throughout this video, if the government requires something to exercise a constitutional right, it has the duty to make compliance universal, affordable, and straightforward. That's not going to be a compromise on any principle. That's how strong institutions are built, when you have those 3 things.